So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Arif to talk to all of us about what we can expect in Montreal.
Good morning, everyone. You know, we win against the Bruins last year. Not Rangers, the Bruins. The Rangers, like, you know, they won last year, but we still have the best Legos in Montreal. Good morning, everyone. I'm really honored to be with you today to address today to you, your representative of the industrial taxi from all over the world. I'm here to invite you for sure for the next year conference, 2015, will be held in Montreal. And I would like you to know that we have a great city, we have great people there. We don't have the Saints in Montreal, but we have the same jersey. We call it the same jersey. So I feel like blessed now. You know, Montreal is recognized as a culture metropolis. And we did a lot of renovations. We have an entertaining district that you're going to see next year if you're there. We have really, it's a lovely city. The taxi industry, it's a part of the city. We have 44,844 taxi permits. We have 10,861 drivers in this industry. And we're looking by 2015 to transform all the limousine in the airport to electricity. So we're going more greener. Last May we had a commission at the City Council. We had a public presentation and we had a recommendation from the commission that we set 5 goals. This new policy, we're going to translate it into English and we're going to send it through Benoit to you guys before the next conference. You know, our city faces so many challenges for the industrial taxi. I knew since the first day I came here to New Orleans, from the first taxi driver that we took, when I asked him the first question, I felt we have the same problems all over the world. And having been here, and with the work you're doing, I know you're finding solutions for these challenges. We're gonna put our experiences together, and hopefully by 2015, we can give you what we know about the taxi industry in Montreal. We're going to do it before with Benoit this year, as Isabelle did yesterday too. We're going to continue on this until 2015. I invite you to attend this conference in large numbers and hope that you will enjoy our beautiful and vibrant city. If I wasn't convinced, I'm going to give you the video. Probably it will convince you more than me. hope to see you all in 2015 in Montreal.
Now we're going to start our public hearing. I'd like to turn the mic over to our board chair, Tom Driscoll, who's going to be the master of ceremonies and let the public hearing begin. Tom?
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Welcome to the IATR's public hearing on proposed accessible taxicab and vehicle for hire model regulations. Before we get started, I'd like to issue a challenge to everyone in the room. Let's all put our cell phones away and pay full attention to these proceedings. Now, I am as guilty as anyone else is, spending a lot of time on my cell phone, checking emails and texts and all that. We've all invested a great deal of our time and efforts to be here. Our agencies or companies have invested resources in us to come away from this conference with cutting-edge knowledge of vehicles for hire regulation. Let's all make good on those investments. As I like to tell my daughters who are in their mid-20s and can't imagine any waking moments without their smartphones, I once went 50 years without my cell phone. If you have urgent business that demands an immediate text, email, or phone call, please deal with it outside this meeting room and our other meeting rooms during the later sessions. The model regulations for accessible taxicabs and vehicles for hire have been a work in progress for many months. I commend Jason Michelle, Matt Doss, and the entire transportation practice group at Wendell's Marks, who have worked very diligently on these model regulations. I'm proud to have participated with many of my fellow regulators from 24 different jurisdictions in the IATR Accessibility Committee, and we've all provided input into this process. A special recognition goes to Jason, who's done the heavy lifting to make these proposed model regulations a reality. I think, like many of us here, I did not begin my career as a regulator with an understanding of the need and necessity for accessible transportation services. I had to be taught about it. Active members of the disabled community in Los Angeles enlightened me. Activists like the late Nathan Croman, who was a longtime transportation and taxicab commissioner in Los Angeles, taught me that the disabled community is one that any one of us can join at any time. And they include our friends, family, and neighbors. They have every right to an equal level of transportation services as those available to the able-bodied. A generation of commissioners, elected officials, and others in positions of authority have been committed to the goal of accessible transportation. As we saw yesterday with Senator Tom Harkin, Senator Harkin has had many colleagues over the years on this issue at state legislatures and in local governments. And these model regulations, which are still in draft form, will be explained to us all in detail by Jason, offer a great opportunity to expand upon the work of past generations. As with any of IATR's model regulations, these proposed regs are designed to help every regulator in every jurisdiction. None of you should ever have to go back to square one on this issue, because you will have these carefully crafted, well-vetted regulations to refer to. Okay, and what I'd like to do at this point, we do have a panel of regulators that have all participated in the accessibility committee. They're not going to make specific presentations at this time, but I would like you each to introduce yourselves, because you can do a better job of it than I can.
I'll start. Can you guys hear me? Oh, great. I'm Jason Michelle. I'm counsel to the IATR's Accessibility Committee. I'm also counsel at Wendell's Marks.
Hi, I'm Benoit Jugan. I'm General Manager for the Bureau du Taxi de Montréal in the city of Montreal.
Hello, I'm John Scott, DC Taxi Cab Commission Chief of Operations. Good morning, everyone. My name is Marcia Anderchuk. I'm with the City of Calgary. I'm a business analyst in our Office of Livery Transport Services.
And Carl Mortimer from the Department of Planning, Transport and Infrastructure in South Australia.
And I'm Tom Hicks from Monterey Salinas Transit, where we provide all transit, paratransit, as well as taxi regulation for a 280 square mile area of Monterey County in Central Coast, California.
Without any further ado, here is Jason Michel, who will present and explain the proposed model regulations. And also read the notice that this is indeed a public hearing.
Yes, I will. Thank you, Tom. So let me just start by saying that this is, as Tom said, the public hearing and opportunity to comment on the IATR's proposed model regulations for accessible taxi cabs and for hired vehicles. The proposed definitions and model regulations attempt to address the fact that while many jurisdictions address accessibility to some degree within their local taxi cab and for hired vehicle regulations, there exists no all-encompassing accessibility regulatory framework that addresses each and every issue that is critical to ensure that people with disabilities are afforded equal enjoyment to fully take advantage of public transportation in this arena. We are holding the hearing today at this wonderful hotel. Comments, in addition to people that would like to sign up to speak today, I've already received some written comments. Written comments can still be submitted. The deadline for these comments will be due on December 22nd, 2014. This is a work in progress. I want to make that clear to everybody in the room. These are proposed model regulations, and we are not only are we excited about what we've done so far, but we are excited to hear from each and every one of you who has a comment, maybe a stakeholder, somebody who's affected by these regulations, somebody who finds things in them that you think that can be improved, and I look forward to hearing from you, because we want this document to be as all-encompassing and as, how can I put this? I want it to be a situation where vehicle manufacturers and disabled advocates can all be happy with this document, and it can be put into practice in a realistic way while providing maximum accessibility. And in order to do that, we need your help to make that happen. You can also comment by mail or by email. These regs are on the IATR website, and you can get that information there as far as how to do that. And I'm going to step up to the podium so I can present the regs to you. Again, before I do get started, I do again want to make clear that it's up there. I do want to make clear again, this is a proposed document. We've worked very, very hard on this, but we are welcoming as many comments as you're willing to give us. And I hope that you like what we've done so far. So as I said, these are the IATR model regulations for accessible taxi cabs and for hired vehicles. So what is the need for model regulations for accessible taxi cabs and for hired vehicles? Well, one is to address the need for cohesive and all-encompassing standards addressing accessibility. One of the things that I found out in my research is that there are many jurisdictions that have accessibility provisions in regards to their taxi for hired vehicle fleets. However, they differ in many, many ways. One of the main ways that I've seen is when you think of accessible vehicles, you tend to think of vehicles that can accommodate people who use wheelchairs or scooters. However, there are people with other disabilities, such as people who are blind, have low vision, who are deaf, or who suffer from hearing loss. And these are also passengers in vehicles that need to be accommodated. They need to be able to communicate with the driver. They need to be able to pay for their fares. And I found that many jurisdictions don't take that into account. Other jurisdictions taxi cabs, but they don't talk about it for hire vehicles. Other jurisdictions tend to combine the accessibility standards of taxi cabs with infrastructure such as airport terminals, bus terminals, and it tends to be more on the side of almost like a building code rather than actually talking about the vehicle themselves. So what we tried to do was take the best of these jurisdictions that actually focused on the vehicles and as well as providing accommodations, and I think we've done a very good job of doing that up until now. The second need for these model regulations is something that I spoke about yesterday, for those of you who attended the panel, which addressed the financial implications of providing accessible transportation. Not to repeat myself from yesterday, but the reality is that accessibility is expensive when you're talking about transportation. Certainly, there are areas in accessibility that you can provide cost-cutting alternatives to provide accommodations or equipment facilitation. And those are all great, such as I referred to yesterday, is providing a portable ramp in a building that might have stairs in front, so instead of having to expend a lot of money on capital costs, you can just put a portable ramp down as long as it's sloped correctly. That's one example of what would be a cost-cutting accommodation. However, in the world of transportation, you're talking about vehicles. Vehicles in and of themselves are expensive, no matter how you look at it, and therefore, in order to be able to realistically tackle this challenge, you also need to tackle the ability to finance the changes that we're proposing. Sorry. Okay, here we go. What do these model regulations address? You're probably asking yourself. Well, vehicle accessibility. We get right into it with the actual vehicle itself and what a vehicle should provide in order to accommodate people with disabilities. Then we go to driver training. Driver training is a very critical component. In my experience, I come from Mayor's Office of People with Disabilities in New York City. I worked there for about 10 years in the Uber administration. I worked very closely with the New York City Taxi and Limousine Commission on trying to improve accessibility, and one of the main issues that kept coming up over and over again is the issue of drivers not being able to do basic things in order to be able to transport someone with a disability, such as strap somebody in properly who's in a wheelchair, and also drivers who are skittish, let's say, in helping passengers in and out of the vehicle who need that help. So it's a critical component. If the drivers are not on board with this and they're not trained properly, it's not going to get done correctly. Third is talking about accessible dispatch programs and app technology. Now, when we set out to do these regulations, we really wanted to stay away as much as possible from the concept of cutting corners. We really wanted to make the vehicles accessible. We wanted to come up with a framework to provide maximum accessibility. But at the same time, in my experience, the concept of accessible dispatch is actually proven to be successful if done properly. I remember learning about this a few years ago. In New York City, we started a pilot program of accessible dispatch in 2007, and now it's a permanent program. But we learned about this, I remember I was at an expo in New York City, and Chicago, so a representative from Chicago was there talking about how they had an accessible dispatch program, which actually led to more accessible vehicles in the fleet. It's a concept that's been a little bit controversial for advocates to accept, because when I was advocating for an accessible dispatch program, advocates would say, well, this is just putting a Band-Aid on the problem. You're just trying to avoid the fact that we wanted a fully accessible taxi fleet. And I would say, listen, you have people who unfortunately are in the frame of mind of, well, we want to see the demand in order for us to provide this kind of thing. And at the same time, you also have people who, if you have a fleet where there are very few vehicles that are accessible, you need access to them. And it might not be the ideal solution right away, but if you incorporate an accessible dispatch program where somebody can call, text, email, go online, reserve an accessible vehicle in advance, this will make people who have with disabilities more comfortable with utilizing the system. They will use it more, and it will lead to more demand, and it will lead to more taxing. And that's what happened in Chicago, and that's why New York City decided to follow that model, and now we have a great accessible dispatch program. So this is an exception to the rule that we try to keep as far as just focusing on accessible vehicles and not necessarily an alternative, meaningful access way to get access to transportation. And so that's why we included it in the regs, as well as app technology, because everybody's using apps these days, and that's another way to access these vehicles. Fourth thing that we address is financing, as I spoke about earlier. In order for this to work, you need to figure out how to fund this. Otherwise, the stakeholders involved, whether it be manufacturers, whether it be just the infrastructure of municipalities, they're not going to go for it. You need to be able to explain to them that this is going to work and this is not going to break the bank. And finally, there's some other miscellaneous provisions which I will show you in the regs themselves. So how were these model regulations derived? Well, there was review and consideration of excessive tax capping for hire vehicle regulations from a number of jurisdictions from around the world, including Australia, Canada, the United States, by a committee of regulators from 24 jurisdictions worldwide. There was also painstaking research of substantive data associated with certain accessible vehicles currently being utilized as taxi cabs for hire vehicles. We also utilized the knowledge and experience with accessibility of those involved in drafting these regulations, including myself. Okay, I have myself on the back, but there's others as well, trust me. And receipt of comments from regulators and industry stakeholders, which is ongoing, by the way, including people with disabilities and disability advocates. Right now, for instance, what we've done is we have a stakeholder group that includes people with disabilities and disability advocates and others who are going to themselves, in addition to the comments we get from people today and comments that we received, are also going to come together to make comments and provide input. And the main reason for that is my experience, again, at the mayor's office, is that people with disabilities want, like any other person who is going to be affected by legislation or a project or whatever it is, they want to be at the table. They want to be able to contribute because this affects them directly. When I first got there, I saw things where even if you have a project or a program that is actually beneficial for people with disabilities, if you do it in a vacuum, if you just say, well, we're going to impose such a thing on you, they're not going to be happy with that. Even if it's beneficial, you really need to bring them to the table, have them part of the discussion, because they have a lot to talk about. They are on the front lines, they know the issues, and it's a win-win for everybody. So that's why we have that stakeholder. So here's a quick overview, and then we'll get to the regs themselves. These proposed model regulations acknowledge certain rights of passengers, operators, and providers, as well as imposing some responsibilities. Further, these proposed model regulations are meant to be incorporated and improved upon existing municipality regulations that may have overlooked or have not mandated particular sectors of accessibility, and are designed to apply to both the widest possible range of people with disabilities and to all owners and operators of taxi cab for hire vehicle fleets and vehicles. And finally, as stated in the United Kingdom, and I use this example because one of the popular examples is the fact that London has a fully accessible taxi fleet. Albeit there are criticisms of the vehicles, I'm not going to get into that, but the fact remains that they have a fully accessible fleet and they should be commended for that. So it's stated in their Department of Transport's taxi driver private hire vehicle licensing best practice guidance document. People with disabilities should be able to hire a taxi on the spot with minimal delay or inconvenience. It's as simple as that. And so it's our belief that these model regulations will help to achieve that result. So I'm going to start with the regs. Now this is a pretty large document, and I want to make sure that I have enough time, we have enough time for the speakers to give their presentations, and I don't want to run too long. So I'm not going to go into detail in each and every section. I'm going to pick out some sections that I think would be of interest to you. And these regs are on the IATR website, so you can get a closer look at them. I believe we have some bound copies as well. But let's just get to it, and I'll get through it. And then once we have some comments, if somebody has a comment about something that maybe I skipped over or whatnot, I can always get back on the screen and we can talk a little more about it. So it starts with a statement, basis, and purpose. Naming them. I just talked to you a little bit about the purpose in the previous slide, and I talked to you about how they were derived. I'll talk to you now about the funding statement, because this is extremely critical to these regulations and having the ability to take home and work. These model regulations propose an accessible transportation lockbox. This is something that I referred to yesterday. It's actually something, and again, not to self-promote or anything, but as I talked about yesterday, Matt Dawes and I wrote an article about creating a new paradigm for ground transportation, and one of the things we propose is this accessible transportation lockbox for each municipality that regulates accessible transportation, whereby a single funding source will be created and overseen by a single transportation agency in order to implement the ideas and data contained within these regulations. This funding source would result from a small surcharge to be added to each taxi cab for hire vehicle trip to be deposited in a single fund and used exclusively for accessibility purposes. However, that's just one way. Further, it's proposed that additional funding be secured from transportation network companies such as Uber, Sidecar, and Lyft in order to confirm the mandate that these TNCs must be held to the same accessibility regulations as properly licensed owners and operators of taxi cab for hire vehicle fleets. And I also mentioned yesterday funding that could come from savings in paratransit. So there's ways to do this in order to take away from the financial hit that this will have, because providing accessibility, as I said, is an expensive proposition, but there's ways to do it responsibly to make it viable. Acknowledgement of rights of passengers, operators, and providers, and prescribing how vehicles are to provide maximum accessibility for disabled passengers, as well as access to aid, non-certain rights. So we talked about that from the UK statement, which again, I'd like to read again because I think it's just really a perfect statement. People with disabilities should be able to hire a taxi on the spot and delay or inconvenience. So then we have an application, how they're supposed to apply to the widest possible range, and they're designed to apply to all owners and operators of fleets and fleets. Next, we get to the definitions. Accessible vehicle means a taxi cab or for hire vehicle that is designed and intended to be used for the purpose of transporting unique persons who use wheelchairs or scooters. Now, I can tell you right now that that's probably going to change to include people who have other disabilities, such as, like I said, people who are blind, low vision, deaf, suffer from hearing loss. They should all be included in what an accessible vehicle is providing. Allocated space, the three-dimensional space that can accommodate wheelchair, single mobility, dispatch definition, referring to the accessible dispatch, which we'll talk about a little later. And what a dispatcher is, equivalent service, again, it's something that we try to shy away from, but we mention it when we're talking about the accessible dispatch program. So I just want to touch upon what equivalent service would be. It means to provide equivalent service and service available to individuals with disabilities, including individuals who use wheelchairs, is provided in the most integrated setting appropriate to the needs of the individual, and is equivalent to the service provided to other individuals with respect to the following service characteristics. response time, fares, geographic area of service, hours and days of service, availability of information, reservations capability, any constraints on capacity or service availability, and restrictions, priorities based on trip purpose. Then we have for hire vehicle, we have paratransit definition, we have a service animal definition, which I'll read to you. Means an animal trained by a recognized school for service as a guide dog for people who are blind or have low vision, or people who are deaf or hard of hearing, which probably should be hearing loss. I'll comment on that very quickly. With my experience with people with disabilities, a lot of thought and emotion is attached to terminology that you use to describe disabilities. I can tell you right now, because I've actually heard the term used a couple of times this week, the term handicap is a no-no. People don't like that term, so we stay away from that. And I would encourage you to stay away from the term handicap. I know it's used a lot. You hear the term handicap parking, for instance. In New York City, we like to call it accessible parking, but it's something that I think that you should keep in mind. And so I bring that up because in the world of people who are deaf or hard of hearing, there are people that think that hard of hearing is a term is somewhat offensive. I've also heard from people who are hard of hearing that they don't mind that at all. But I've gotten comments recently that they prefer hearing loss, so that might change. So I'm just bringing that up just to let you know that you should keep that in mind. All right, so let's keep it.
If I may.
Yes.
I want to point out that the word handicap comes from the days when disabled people were in wheelchairs. They had a cap in their hand begging for alms. That's where the term handicap actually originates.
That's great, yes. All right, so let's keep moving. I'm going to try to speed this up a little bit so we can get to the speaker's definition of taxi. Okay, so chapter 3, this is the meat of what a vehicle should include in it. The general statement here that people who use wheelchairs and mobility aids must be able to enter and exit a conveyance and position their aids in the allocated space, or else they have to have some sort of equivalent access. So let me go through 3.2 real quick, because this is kind of a master list of what every accessible vehicle should have. Must be equipped with an interior mirror designed to provide the driver with view of passengers. Must be equipped with lights arranged to illuminate all the interior of the vehicle that shall be constantly lit during loading or unloading passengers. Equipped with a light above or beside each passenger access door to illuminate the loading equipment. Must be equipped with a means of securing in the open position each passenger access door that can be subject to unintentional closing during the loading or unloading of passengers. Have an interior that's free of any sharp projections. Must have a permanently bonded to the floor the aisle steps floor covering that is fire retardant, skid resistant, wear resistant, rubber or equivalent material. Yellow or white step nosings. Must have the capability to transfer a reduced mobility rider from the curb to the taxi for hire vehicle. For example, be a turnout seat. Must provide strategic placement of bright yellow easy to grab handrails and stanchions. Non-slip floor covering, clearly marked edge seats. Contrasting delineation of any gap for passing money through a screen. Strong illumination of the roof sign. Equipped with internal cameras, 24/7 GPS devices. Capacity to allow access to carry at least one person using a wheelchair, scooter, or other large mobility aid. Must have provision of rapid release of each wheelchair or other mobility aid in case of accident or emergency. A standardized first aid kit that's in compliance with the municipality's local standards. Every accessible vehicle shall be equipped with, for the transportation of wheelchair users, shall be equipped with wheelchair, scooter, or other mobility aid security devices that limit the forward, backward, rotational, lateral, and vertical motion of each wheelchair, scooter, or other mobility aid. And then we talk about the normal operation using full throttle acceleration. So a lot of these terms you'll see are relatively technical, and I imagine that we're going to have some comments from manufacturers to kind of take this language and make sure that it meets standards that can be met. We talk more about the security devices. We talk about, in terms of load that you can withstand, and then how a vehicle should be equipped with a lap statue, pelvic type occupant restraint assembly. So we're talking about safety here. Every designated more restrained assembly stuff, you have to be securely anchored. Then we start getting into ramps and what the slope should be. And this might come under some discussion, but again, using the research that we did, we came up with 1 in 14 for unassisted access, and 1 in 8 for unassisted where the ramp length was less than 60 inches, and 1 in 4 for assisted access. Then we get more into the ramps, how they have to have an anti-skid surface, how they must operate at certain temperatures, how their side barriers will swing up and provide a white center stripe. Then we get into lifts, so because some vehicles use power lifts. And again, we talk about skid resistant things. Everything in here is basically to provide safety. Now, one of the things that I've learned is there's going to be some discussion regarding the weight bearing load. Right here, we talk about a lift that can be capable of raising and lowering a minimum weight of 660 pounds. I'm anticipating having some comments about that, that might not be enough, but again, it's a minimum weight, and we might be considering putting in a range, but that is to be determined. So again, most of that is just the technical stuff about a lift. And again, here's another thing about the boarding device must be able to support a total weight of 660 pounds of bid span. I know we're going to get comments about that because I've already had some discussions during the conference about this. And again, this is a working document, so I'm inviting comments, and we'll work with you and others who have a stake in this to make sure that these kinds of things that we're proposing will make everybody happy. So let's keep it on. Talk about the amount of space should be. Again, I'm going to get comments on that. I've already talked about, we'll be talking about the space going 31.5 inches width by 51.2 length by 9.05 height. There's, some of these specs, there might be some specs that the jurisdiction has that just don't go along with it. So the question becomes how do you work with that? These are model regulations that we're hoping will eventually take hold in many jurisdictions that will take a look and maybe change what they're doing. So I don't want people to get afraid when they see numbers like this, because we're trying to come up with the ultimate, with the gold standard, as it were, trying to provide an accessibility. We just want to allocate space, minimum headroom, and then we get into doors. And here's where we start talking about people who are blind or low vision, and we talk about raised lettering or symbols. One of the things that that I've talked about with advocates for blind or low vision is the use of Braille versus raised lettering, because Braille is not as popular, as it used to be. So we want to make sure that we incorporate as many forms of communication as we can, and not just say, well, it has to be Braille or raised lettering, or neither, one or the other. Why in that scope? And then we talk about color high contrast. One of the things that I put in here is something about this distinct sound. If you can imagine if you were somebody in the city and you're blind, have no vision, and you're looking for a vehicle, it would help if the vehicle is making a certain sound that you know it's an accessible vehicle. It just makes sense. Now, in an ideal world, if every vehicle is accessible, you won't need that. But if you're in a situation where it's a certain percentage, it's going to help people who are blind or low vision to know, hey, this car coming by is accessible. And again, you might be thinking, oh, what if they're not in a wheelchair or a scooter? But what if they are? And again, okay, so let me keep moving because I got to get to the speakers. But okay, so let's just keep moving. More about carers, assistant service animals, international accessibility display, therapy and ticket validation systems, general information that needs to be provided. Chapter 4 now is the accessible dispatch, which I was talking about, which is the equivalent access. This is the exception to the rule about providing equivalent access. And I've already talked about how it should be 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, no advance reservations. And you can read about that, but then we've already talked about that. Here's in chapter 5 now, here's the driver vetting and training. We wanted to make sure that this was covered as much as we could, such as you see 5.4, a complete accessibility training program, including boarding and deboarding protocols, first-person language, disability awareness, and etiquette, you'd be surprised to get a pair of drivers that don't know etiquette. It's a very important thing when you're doing the passenger. And then we talk about it, Matt had mentioned in one of his talks about a thorough background check. We want to make sure that drivers have a thorough background check, includes a criminal history, driver history check. And here we go to Chapter 6 with the funding mechanism, which we talked about the accessible lot dollars. Okay, and so let me keep going. We already talked about that. I'm going to end now, except I want to talk about one more thing in these other divisions. It's something that I'm kind of, I added myself because a good friend of mine is a wheelchair user who's actually the commissioner of the Mayor's Office of People with Disabilities right now. And he has a family of 4, and one of the issues is if you have a taxi that can fit 4 people in it, and you're in a wheelchair, and all of a sudden you can only fit yourself and one other person, we're talking about using 2 different taxis to go the same trip. So I put in there something about if the vehicle being utilized for the taxi allows for a certain number of passengers who don't need wheelchairs, then you should be able to have the same fare for both cars. So that's the regs in a nutshell. I appreciate you listening, and now we're going to get to the speakers.
Yes, what we'll actually do now is let's take in some of the comments and then look at the speakers as well. I think first commenter actually has a presentation for us.
Yes, please welcome John Walsh from NB1.
Good morning. I'm John Walsh. I'm the Vice President of Mobility Ventures. We're the makers of the universally accessible taxi, the MV1. First off, I want to tell you that I thought April 30th in New York City was the most exciting day in my career, but I believe today is going to top that. Matt, thank you, Jason, for what you're doing to develop these regulations for accessibility. It's very exciting for the disabled community, I can tell you that right now. It's wonderful. So what I'm going to do is walk you through the MV1. It's one of your choices as an accessible taxi. And I want to talk to you a little bit about how we developed this car. So we took the ADA, which was signed in 1990, as all of you know, and you really see this top left-hand picture. It's a very famous picture of that day with President Bush. But what we did is we took the ADA regulations and we built a car. We took a ramp and we built a car around it. Instead of taking a car and trying to figure out how we're going to get a ramp in that car. So we took a completely different approach. And there's some people in the room here today that were the pioneers of this vehicle. As you can see some of these illustrations on the bottom, Mark Klein being one of those. So we took the dimensions of the ADA and we built this car. We took everything in mind. And as I read through these regulations, you guys are hitting on a lot of those dimensions. But for us, we're already there. We've already built the car, and it meets the ADA 100% with no exceptions at all. We built a durable chassis. This is a body-on-chassis vehicle, and we fully tested it in the streets of New York, and I'll get to that in just a second. Side entry is a big question mark while you're developing these regulations. I will tell you this, it's safer, it's more convenient, and it's much more efficient. The driver can get a passenger on and off that taxi much quicker in a side entry application. And one thing I want to remind you guys as you're looking at these regulations, the ADA was written around what? Curb-to-curb service, never from the street. So side entry is not exclusive to the MD1. It's really important. I think Jason makes a good point. These regulations need to be fair for all the manufacturers. Side entry can be done by anyone in the mobility, equipment, vehicle industry, anyone. So I encourage you to do side entry. Wow, this is a big picture. Safety. We cannot forget safety in these regulations at all. The MV1 is fully crash tested with no exemptions and no exceptions, none. And as a matter of fact, we just finished crash testing 32 MV1s. at our facility in South Bend, Indiana. 32. 4 of them we went forward and tested with a partition in an MV1. So the MV1 is fully crash tested with a partition, something no one else has done. We're probably a year ahead of where the regulations in most cities will be, but we're already there, and that's what's important. So don't forget safety when you're developing the regulations. AM General, big question mark. You've heard about the MV1 for years. We do have new owners. They bought us a year ago, and we're in full production. And as you can see, this company's been building vehicles since the early 1900s. Very reliable product, and very proud to have AM General as our owners. Here's our plant. It's 675,000 square feet. That white plant you see, there's a plant in the back, that's the military plant. Well, this is our campus, and that plant can manufacture 75,000 cars a year. So capacity is not an issue, and it should be an issue for anyone. As you can see, we are a true OEM manufacturer. I mentioned safety to you again. NHTSA is the group that handles all the safety regs for crash testing. I'm going to flip through these slides very quickly, but I want you to take note of one thing. When you develop these regulations, do not let anyone take exceptions at all to this following list of FMVSS regulations. No exemptions and no exceptions. Because each one of these items you see, we have fully tested for. And there's no reason why you should buy a wheelchair accessible taxi that hasn't been fully crash tested. FTA, We Need Buy America. Why is this important to this group? Maria Guerrero yesterday talked about a funding source that she has in Chicago for $20,000. That's also funded by the FTA. And in order to receive that grant money, your vehicle has to meet Buy America. And of course, we're right in South Bend, Indiana, and this car is almost 85% US made. So I wanted to mention that to you as well. Where are these cars? Jason had some slides yesterday on Accessoride, which I thought were great slides. And he showed these big, huge buses. Guys are going away in New York. We just received an order for 147 more MV1s at New York City's MTA's Accessoride system, bringing their total fleet of MV1s to 407, which is very impressive, of a fleet of 1,600 buses. So the big buses, Jason, I think are a thing of the past, which is good news. We also have them in taxi service in New York, the yellows and the greens that we like to talk about pretty often. You guys are very familiar. We have them in Chicago. Maria spoke yesterday. They actually have 163 accessible taxis, and they have some good regulations there in Chicago. Connecticut has over 140 of our cars. A lot of you know Bill Scalzi that does the WOW app, and a lot of these cars are Bill's in Connecticut. Canada, what a great story. Canada has done some great things for us up there as our distributor. They've actually had pilot programs in Montreal, and you may hear about those a little bit more here in a few minutes, where they tested a vehicle before they made a choice, which I think is very important. So I wanted to at least mention this slide that Matt has done a great job of making this an international meeting, which I think is very good, and we have a good presence in Canada. Fuel and innovation. Our car, by option, can come with compressed natural gas. So what's better than an American-made car with American-made fuel? That's about $2 a gallon. So it's a very good business case. We do build this on the assembly line, and I did want to mention the CNG option on our car. Challenge you to possibly put in more than hybrids in some of these regulations, because CNG does the same thing. Those are our 3 products. The SC, the DX, and the LX was a brand new one we just introduced into the black car market. The livery market, we're very proud of this car. It's a beautiful vehicle. And that's all I have. Thanks, Jason.
Thank you, Jason.
It's actually not a question, it's just little comments. First of all, we want to, I'm talking in the name of Kimball, not in my personal name. And we did do our presentation yesterday, so you have an idea of where we stand. But we still wanted to add a few comments. First of all, to commend the IATR for having this original approach of a broader spec of consultation on what should be done. We think that one of the issues that we want to address is we have mentioned that training is mandatory, but we think that it should be broader than just to the accessible vehicles. There should be a way to have all taxi drivers have their training, at least a sensitivity training regarding the needs of people with different disabilities and elderly, because most people, not everybody's going to go directly to the accessible taxi service, but they might need help. And of course, the training specific to those with the accessible vehicles on how to better tie down and make sure that you don't hit the person when you're putting the seatbelt on them and things like that. We also think that there is funding for paratransit dispatch system via a surcharge on taxi fare does not appear adequate for us, because taxi drivers will see people with disabilities as the one bringing on more cost to them. There should be a fund that would be put together or something that would make it not the taxi drivers feels like they're paying for the person with a disability. And we also had a comment about the responsibility of providing the accessible taxi service to all dispatch companies in the territory. So it shouldn't be only to a specific company that would only cater to the people with disabilities, but all taxi companies should have some accessibility and some vehicle that can cater to that need. And specific to Montreal area, we are wishing for a minimum 30-minute response so that we feel like we're included like everybody else and we're not waiting an hour or 2 hours when we call for a taxi driver. And that should be 24 hours a day and 7 days a week, just like anybody else that wants to go out at night. So that's our basic comments.
Thank you very much. I want to point out that in Los Angeles we have a surcharge for bad taxi cab enforcement. And the way we designed this so it wouldn't be onerous on the drivers was to just actually make it a $1 per vehicle per day assessment. And we added 20 cents to the flag drop, but all a driver has to do is 5 trips in a day, and everything beyond that goes into the driver's pocket. So they've never really had a problem with the surcharge. It was designed that way. Our next person who's put in to speak is Mark Klein.
Hi, good morning. Thanks to Jason and Matt for putting this together. It's a great opportunity to talk to everybody at once. As you can imagine, I can talk about this for hours and hours and hours. But I have two points that I'd just like to make, and I probably make this point to a lot of you when I fly around the country and visit you. The first point is really economics. So we all know that the taxi cab industry is driven in large measure by economics, what people can afford, what vehicles people can afford to buy, what fare passengers can afford to pay, and there's a huge interaction between the economics of the taxi cab industry and the service that's actually provided on the street. So the next level that I think I've seen in providing taxi cab service, and this is with the TNCs on the other side of the coin attracting drivers, particularly an UberX kind of model where taxi cab service to the riding public is actually going the other way from wheelchair accessibility. I'm starting to think that perhaps regulations should prioritize the vehicles and operations that benefit society the most. So the most accessible vehicles, the most clean vehicles, the best air quality vehicles, the vehicles that make the drivers the most money, the vehicles that make the fleets the most money, and overriding all of this is a topic I don't think we ever talk about, which is bringing more revenue to cities, bringing more convention business, bringing more tourism. Atlanta is the biggest airport in the United States of America, and nobody leaves the airport. Nobody wants to go. So their taxi industry, their drivers are starving. They've been trying to revise the regulations there for 3 years. Cedric Burst isn't even here anymore. So these issues are complicated, but you can empower the hotel associations, the managers of the hotel, the restaurant associations, and try to work with the city to provide the best possible service for society. And then included in that is accessibility. There are 54 million people with disabilities, about 5 million wheelchair users, about 14 million people can't walk a quarter mile or climb a flight of stairs. Those people don't go anywhere on vacation. So cities that have accessible transportation are going to bring more passengers. More passengers means more fares, more money in the driver's pocket, and then they can begin to afford better vehicles. So I think it's all connected, and I think I'm probably pitching something close to Allegassi and the TLPA. And all the elements really have to work together. And if they do, and we focus on providing the best benefits to society, and of course that's where clean energy comes in. It was Boone Pickens' idea to invest $20 million in the original MB1. He knew that providing low-cost natural gas would attract the drivers. So you saw Bill Scalzi, he's got natural gas. It's the economics that really drive the change. So thank you.